My friend Helen is a journalist. She often writes for some of the big papers, the Times, the Telegraph, Financial Times, and she wrote an article this week after an interview with Ruth Madeley, the actress. And she said something really shocking in her interview. Ruth Madeley is disabled, she's in a wheelchair. And Ruth said to Helen, we read it in her article, she said she was brought up in a Christian family, still a Christian, and she said that she often gets communications from Christians telling her that she is disabled because she isn't praying hard enough, because her faith isn't strong enough. Now, I was horrified by this, and Helen was posting this on Facebook, so I'm like, no, we don't want this, please. Can we just counter this argument? I thought that we've kind of got over that kind of nonsense. In fact, the church would generally consider that spiritual abuse if people said that today. But on a lower level than that, just have faith is often something that we hear. It might even be something that we might feel like saying, and it's a saying that we often kind of reach for when we don't know what else to say, when things are frightening, when things are uncertain, when someone is struggling, when prayers don't seem to be answered. We say, just have faith. Just have faith. It'll be all right if you just have faith. Have more faith. Trust harder. Don't doubt. And I think that is sometimes how we can read this gospel reading that we've had this morning. Jesus' words to Peter as he's out on the water. You of little faith, Jesus says to Peter, why did you doubt? And we can almost hear this as a little bit of a telling off, can't we? Peter was doing so well. The water was stormy, the waves were high. Peter had reached out to Jesus. He'd stepped out of the boat. He trusted in Jesus and stepped out of the boat and was walking towards Jesus. But then he realised quite how stormy and rough the seas around him were. If only he had kept his eyes on Jesus, if only his faith had been stronger, he would have been okay. Except I'm not sure that is what this story is about. And we have to kind of look at the context of this passage. And Matthew sets this passage, as I said, directly after the feeding of the 5,000 and a few. Jesus goes up to pray on the mountainside. He sends his disciples out before him. And while they're there, they find themselves a long way from land, and the boat is being battered by the waves and the storm. And there's something really, really lovely and honest about these details. These are people that follow and love Jesus. They have literally just watched him do the most amazing things. They are doing exactly what Jesus is telling them to do. He's the one that sent them across the lake, and yet still they find themselves in the middle of the storm because their faithfulness has not sheltered them from any difficulty. Now, that matters. That's a really important part of this story, because we can so easily slip into believing that if we are faithful enough, if we pray enough, if we trust enough, then somehow life is going to be rosy and everything is going to be wonderful and work out. And then when it doesn't, we start to wonder what it is that we have done wrong. But the disciples absolutely hadn't done anything wrong at that point. They had been faithful to Jesus and had followed him. Sometimes the wind is just simply against us. Sometimes we just find ourselves a long way from where we thought we were going to be. Sometimes the waves just keep on coming. Sometimes the things that we thought were secure and okay are shaken and everything becomes much less certain. Sometimes our own certainty of who we are, what we are supposed to do, and even who God is shaken. Our plans become much less certain. And that is what I think this passage is about. Because it is into that situation that Jesus comes. Not when the sea becomes calm. There is another time where Jesus calms the storm. He doesn't in this passage. Not when the disciples have kind of got themselves together. Jesus comes while the wind is still blowing at them, while the boat is still being battered. And at first they don't even recognise what's going on. They don't even see it. Their eyes aren't open to what is happening at this point, so they think that Jesus is a ghost. I find that quite strangely reassuring too. I don't know about you. Sometimes God's presence in our lives and in our situations isn't immediately obvious. Sometimes fear is much easier to recognise than God. So the disciples see something coming towards them and they interpret it in the situation that they're already in. They're frightened, so they see something else that is frightening for them. And Jesus says to them, "Take heart. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." But then, obviously, Peter does something that is quite characteristically Peter-like. He says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out of the water." So Jesus says, "Come then. Come to me." So Peter climbs over the side of the boat, gets into the water. Now there's something really, really lovely and magnificent about this moment. And I understand why they've made it the centre of the story, because who wouldn't want that type of faith where you could just kind of jump out onto something that would never have held you at any time before? That faith that steps out confidently into what is physically impossible, and that faith that somehow rises across the storm. I would love that kind of walking on water kind of faith. When life is difficult, I would love to know absolutely, surely, and certainly, completely and utterly convinced that God is there, because I love certainty, I love control. I would love to know that if I trust enough, everything would be all right. But then Peter sinks. And perhaps we shouldn't be quite surprised by that, as we often are. Because actually the reality is human beings don't walk on water. Peter sinking isn't evidence that he is a terrible disciple. It isn't evidence that he's done something wrong. It's just evidence that he's human. And then perhaps that changes the way that we hear Jesus' word. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Not as a telling off, but as a recognition that Peter's little faith has already done something extraordinary. He has recognised Jesus for exactly who he is. He has left the boat, he has stepped towards him, and when he begins to sink, he does one more thing. He cries out, "Lord, save me." And for me, this is where the heart of the story lies. Because Matthew tells us that Jesus immediately reached out his hand to him and caught him. Immediately reached out his hand and caught him. Peter doesn't have to prove his faith first. Jesus doesn't stand over him while he's disappearing beneath the waves. He doesn't ask him whether he's learned his lesson. He doesn't ask Peter to try harder. He doesn't tell Peter to believe harder. He doesn't tell Peter to stop doubting. He just reaches out his hand. So perhaps faith isn't principally about walking on water. Perhaps faith is also discovering that when we are sinking, there is a hand reaching out towards us. Perhaps our faith is also about learning to become that hand for someone else that reaches out, because that is what Jesus does throughout the rest of the gospel. He reaches out his hand towards people that everybody else is avoiding. He touches lepers. He stops the woman who has been bleeding, stops the bleeding for the woman who has been suffering with that for 12 years. He gives sight to people who are blind. He sits at tables with people who respectable society wouldn't even give the time and day. And he reaches out towards the people who are grieving, those who are frightened, those who are excluded, those who are ashamed and overwhelmed. And he does it again and again and again. He reaches out to people who are in way over their heads. And very often that reaches out happens to other people. And I wonder if you can think of someone that has done that for you. Someone who has phoned maybe at the right moment. Someone who has asked you if you were okay and really wanted to hear the answer. Someone who has noticed that you aren't quite yourself. Someone who has sat with you when you just needed someone to be with you in the mess rather than trying to fix everything. Or someone who offered practical help when everything had got a bit much. Someone who reminded you, perhaps without even realising it, that you weren't on your own in this. Now, these things are really everyday, they're really ordinary, they don't look like a miracle. Nobody walks across a lake. But perhaps they are closer to the kind of faith that Jesus is showing us than we sometimes realise. And we live in a culture, don't we, where people appear to walk on water, where people appear and are recognised and celebrated for doing extraordinary things. When people are amazingly successful or amazingly strong, or people seem incredibly certain about where they are going and what they are doing. And we can fall into that trap as churches too. We can often think that mature faith means certainty. We can often think that a mature faith means never doubting. It means confidence and never admitting that we are struggling. But Jesus gives us Peter. Peter believes and he doubts. He steps forward and he becomes frightened. He walks and he sinks. He is brave enough to leave the boat, but he is vulnerable enough to cry out when he is struggling. And Jesus reaches out his hand and pulls him up. So our faith doesn't need to be about becoming unsinkable. It just is about continuing to trust that neither the storm or our fear or our doubts or any of it put us beyond the reach of God. So we can take that hand. We can walk on water, we can be struggling and sinking, knowing that that hand is there to pull us out. We can be that hand for others, just watching and seeing what is going on around us. Sometimes we will be the ones that have run out of strength. Sometimes we will be frightened by the winds and the storms going on around us. Sometimes we can be the boat and the shelter for others. Perhaps faith is being willing to say, Lord, save me. So that's the question that this gospel leads us. Not whether our faith is strong enough to walk on water. It is much simpler than that. Where is someone sinking? Where might Jesus be asking us to reach out a hand? And where in our own lives do we need to stop trying to walk on water and allow ourselves to take the hand already reaching out towards us? Offer a hand, take a hand. And trust that even when the wind is against us, Christ is still there, still coming towards us. Amen.